part of the difficulty with learning is that there's a real catch-22, that the knowledge you need to guide your learning process, you also don't have when you start. So it's not just that learning Chinese is difficult because there's a lot of Chinese knowledge that I don't have. It's also that I don't have much knowledge about how is Chinese structured? Like, what's the best way to learn it? I don't have that. And that means that if you're a self-directed learner, so if you're doing what I'm advocating, which is like, taking on your own projects, you're really at the mercy of the materials you find, right? So if you, like, for instance, like I'm making this kind of esoteric point about Duolingo, but like the average person is totally oblivious to this, right? Like it's a very subtle distinction about whether you're doing retrieval flashcard for a word or whether you're drag and dropping. Like this is not something that you're going to notice when you're doing it, that like, oh, this is why it doesn't work as well, because I'm not doing this key element of this activity. It's a totally opaque to you. And that's the same with most classes. Like if you take a class that it just turns out is badly taught, like they're not telling you what you need to know, you're not going to know. You're just going to be like, I must not be very good at this, right? And so this can lead to a lot of frustrations and difficulties, and especially for skills where there's lots of materials, there's lots of different things you can use. You can be overwhelmed. Like language learning is one of those things where, as I said, like I've done it enough times that like I prefer Pimsleur to Duolingo, and I think these resources are good, and everyone's going to have different opinions and different strategies as well. But that you don't come into it from the first time with that knowledge. And so, especially for a subject you can only learn once, this can create a lot of frustration, because it's like, oh man, if I'd only known this, I would have done it differently from the beginning. So meta-learning is what I talk about in my book, of this process of kind of like preparing your map of like, what does this skill actually look like? How do people learn it? How is it organized? What are going to be the bottlenecks? Like, what is going to be the difficulty? Like, what is going to be the thing I have to focus on in order to get good at this? And there's different levels of abstraction there. So learning a language, for instance, we can talk about it at a very basic level. We know that there's going to be vocabulary, pronunciation, grammar. So vocabulary is going to be things you have to memorize. Grammar is going to be a kind of procedural skill. It's going to be kind of like, how do you assemble the little parts into a sentence the correct way? And, depending on the language, that could be fairly simple, like Chinese, where you're just kind of ordering words, or it could be like Russian, where you have also like all these cases and inflections and stuff. And then there's going to be pronunciation, which, again, for some languages is going to be relatively trivial. If you're an English speaker, Japanese and Spanish, not going to be too hard, probably. Mandarin with its tones is going to be very hard. And then there's like, indigenous languages in the Amazon that are like near impossible. They've got so many phonemes. So if you have this kind of abstract, okay, very high level, these are what I'm going to have to build in. But then you break it down further. So if I know I'm learning Mandarin, for instance, I can look up, okay, well, I know it has characters. How many characters does the average person need to know to like read or to be able to function? So if I'm also trying to be literate, I know that, well, you probably need between 2,000 and 3,500 to be able to read things. Okay. I know that most words are actually not one character, but more than one character. They're usually like in modern Mandarin, I would say the majority of words are disyllabic. So you have two characters next to each other. That's how words are formed. And then I'm going to dig deeper. I'm going to figure out, how do characters work? And I look it up and I'd be like, okay, well, some of the characters are pictures. A lot of them are more like rhymes. Like it's like, this sounds like another thing that it's, that has a picture. And there's different kinds of, that they're organized by radicals. So that's how you look them up in the dictionary. Maybe you like go even deeper and you can be like, oh, okay, well, there's a method for learning the characters where you're figuring out like kind of how they came about, like their etymology and this kind of thing. So this is sort of like, I'm not saying you would necessarily come to all those conclusions if you just Google like how to learn Mandarin or how to learn characters or how do Chinese characters work. But let's say if you knew you were going to spend at least 100 hours learning it, and you spent the first 10 hours just like, what are all the ways of learning Mandarin? What are all the resources? How does the language structured? How does it work? What do people find difficult? Blah, blah, blah. You're going to be much, much more well-equipped to make those decisions about how to learn and how to like guide your learning and how to have proper expectations than if it were just like, Duolingo, I'm going to download that and start practicing. Now, again, going back to the context of this, part of the context is you have some serious goal. You're ready to start. You're going to embark on a big, intensive project. If you're not ready for that yet, if you're like, I don't even know whether I want to learn Mandarin, then just learning a little bit and dabbling is not so bad, because when you learn a subject, you also necessarily acquire some metalinguist or sort of meta-learning knowledge about it. So if I start learning math, I start to also figure out, okay, what is this learning math thing like, right? So you can also do it a dabbling approach, but I highly recommend the investing in the meta-learning as a precursor to doing, if you're doing any kind of like, well, I'm spending the next 3 months full-time doing this, I highly recommend, spending that 10, 20 hours doing this, just because if you can identify, oh, this resource works better than this for this good reason, you might save yourself 10 hours and that took 10 minutes. So there's a balance there. And I've made that mistake. Like, I did a project after the Year Without English where I was doing portrait drawing. And my naive theory of how you get good at artistic skills was that, well, I just need to draw a lot and get good feedback. And so what I was doing, my sort of technique that I was using, is I would draw a portrait and then I would take a picture of my drawing and I would overlay it transparently with Photoshop over the original image to be like, oh, I made the eyes too big or I made the head too small. And that's not a terrible technique. But the thing that I didn't realize at the time was that there are actually really good techniques for sizing things, for doing things that is not just something you just acquire from feedback. Like, it's a method you have to learn, just like long division is a method. And, if you were just given random division problems and you just guessed and got feedback, you wouldn't naturally invent long division. So that's an example where my meta learning research failed, because I did a cursory survey of like, what are techniques for portrait drawing? And I didn't find this one. And so I started doing the other thing. And then about halfway through, I was like, nah, I'm kind of hitting diminishing returns. I got to go do another meta-learning research. And then I found about this technique and it helped a lot. So there's kind of an interplay between doing the practice and like getting the feedback. And one of the best ways you can get that feedback is by talking to people who've already learned it. Sometimes this can be a little bit iffy because, well, I've been doing it for 20 years and so I totally forget how I've learned it is a problem. But definitely if you can find someone who's learned it recently, that helps. And also finding people who teach it, because if you teach it, you're regularly in contact with people who have not learned it. So talking to a teacher, even if you're not going to like attend the fancy art school, talking to someone who teaches art and be like, how would you learn to draw? They're going to have some ideas about that because they're interacting with students all the time. Or, maybe I can't afford the expensive all immersion Mandarin class, but I can talk to a Mandarin teacher and be like, what do I need to do to like, what resources do you recommend? And that would help too. So doing this kind of cursory research is, I think, very helpful to overcome at least partly that paradox of how do you learn something when you don't already know it,